It's just turned 7:30. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this first Zoom webinar of CSAR. I trust everybody is safe and well. I'll dispense with parish messages on this occasion and focus on the main event, which I'm delighted to say is Professor Mark Post of Maastricht University. But perhaps rather appropriately at this time when many of us are perhaps spending more time thinking about food than we normally do, Professor Post is going to talk to us about how we make meat from cells. Still, as usual, the better if I say less and leave it to Professor Post, who is Professor of Physiology, but has spread his expertise from understanding how animals work to understanding how we might work by feeding off, well, let me stop. Let me just remind you that it will be possible to ask questions by two methods. One is by the instructions that you will see on the screen about how to get in to send a message through by writing in, and we will collect those messages during the talk. At the end of the talk and not before, it will be possible for you to raise your hand, as it says on the screen, and we will do our best to bring you in an orderly manner. I'm delighted to say that Edward Briffer is the brains behind this operation, and he controls everything. He may even be controlling your life now, but I can't be sure about that. He's certainly controlling mine. Enough of that. Professor Post, we're delighted to have you with us, and please talk to us about making meat from cells.
Well, thank you. And I'm also delighted to be here or be in this virtual capacity, which is obviously a little bit different from usual, but I think it will mostly be the same experience, at least for you. And I'm also delighted there are so many participants at this hour. It's a very appropriate organization to speak to, because obviously what we are doing is applied research and applying basically a medical technology to food production. So I will share my screen here and start the presentation. I trust you see my screen. So the title is From Medicine to Hamburgers, and as I mentioned, it's a medical technology now used to make hamburgers basically, or meat in general. And why are we doing that? We are doing that because providing food for the world population is a terribly complex task. And it's getting increasingly complex, going from 7 to 10 or maybe 11 billion people with more and more sophisticated needs for food, for high quality food and diversity in food. And that's particularly a problem because, like me, 95% of the people like meat. They love meat. It's a staple in our diet, and it's apparently somewhat difficult to get rid of. And why is that a problem? That's a problem because meat is a very intense, resource-intense part of our diet. For instance, a quarter pound of hamburger, you require about 7 pounds of grain as input to the cow, 210 liters of fresh water, 75 square feet for grazing, and enough energy to power your microwave for about 10 minutes. So, and that's only one hamburger. So it's an incredibly resource-intense part of our diet, much more than vegetables or pulses. And so intense, in fact, that we currently, according to the FAO, use 70% of all our arable land for agricultural land for basically feeding animals. And the same FAO predicts that in 2050, the global consumption of meat will be 70% higher than it is right now. And you might think, how come? Because, you know, we live in a society where we are day to day confronted with these issues, and we probably have seen numbers that meat consumption is decreasing somewhat in Western Europe and in the Americas, but globally, the meat consumption is going to increase. So not here, but elsewhere. And we simply cannot currently, with the current methods, produce that type of meat, that amount of meat. In addition, and I don't know how it is in the UK, but in the Netherlands, you cannot open a page of the newspaper without some reference to the environmental impact of agriculture in general and animal husbandry in particular, with respect to greenhouse gas emission, nitrous, methane, CO2, to the extent that somewhere between 50 and 20% of all greenhouse gas emission actually comes from livestock agriculture. So that's a tremendous portion of that total greenhouse gas emission. Why is that? Why is meat, and particularly beef, such a resource-intense material? And that's because if you look at a cow as a technology, kind of a technology that converts grass or its feed into muscle, our food, then it has a terrible efficiency. It's called the conversion ratio. And for a cow, it's about 8. So that means that you have to put 8 times more calories and proteins into the cow than you get out in terms of meat. Now you see here for pork, it's a lot better. For chicken, it's even better. And for fish, it's close to plants. So there are other issues with fish, of course, with aquaculture, but in terms of efficiency, it's okay. Cows, however, are not. And they cannot help it. They were never designed to be such a big staple of our food. And they're ruminants, so their kind of metabolism is different from ours. This is a kind of a weird graph. It's a weird statistic. It's the human trophic level. It's where we are in the food chain. It's 1 for a plant, it's 2 for an animal that eats plants, and it's 3 for an animal that eats animals that eats plants. And we are about at 2.35. I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but here the top kind of pinkish line is where we are, and meaning that 35% of our calories come from animals that eat plants. And look, the line that India and China are following over the last 30 years, they're gradually creeping up to that same number. And why is that? And you see that on the right-hand graph here, that human trophic level, that where we are in the food chain, is linearly related to the gross domestic product of a country. In other words, if we become richer and there are more middle-class incomes, meat consumption is going to increase. And that's where that 70% of increase predicted by the FAO in 2050 is mostly coming from, and part, of course, from the increase in world population. So now we can all become vegetarians, but as I mentioned, less than 5% of the population, at least in industrialized countries, is vegetarian. Of course, in India and China, it's much higher because they cannot afford meat. But it turns out that it's difficult to transform from a meat eater to a vegetarian. And there are increasing trends, especially among highly educated young people in certain pockets of society. But it's still not kind of a mainstream behavior. So what else can we do? Well, we can try to use basically biotech or synthetic biology, if you like, to start creating meat. More or less the same product with the same nutritional value, but made in a different way. And currently, there are several ways of doing this. Here you see a muscle all the way to the left, like a steak, and then that kind of, if you microscopically analyze it, you can get to the muscle kind of bundles, and then individual muscle fibers, and then an individual muscle cell, and in the end, the contractile proteins, actin and myosin, which are about 60% of all the proteins in a muscle cell. So you can go through various routes. You can basically make those proteins, make make them recombinantly by bacteria or yeast or whatever, and try to kind of make a protein mix out of that that has the same nutritional value. However, it's very doubtful that that will create all the sensory qualities of meat. Then you can make a cell-based meat, which is currently what a couple of companies are doing, basically creating animal cells, and mixing them with an otherwise plant-based product. You can make organoids, muscle organoids. That's what we are doing, and that's the first kind of muscle fiber, the basic muscle fiber that composes the entire muscle in the end. And then you can go one step further and try to recreate the entire tissue. Basically trying to make a ribeye steak with the fat tissue, with the muscle tissue, with the fibrous tissue, maybe even with a bone. So those are the kind of the four flavors. And we are somewhere here in this, we, as I mean, I should have said that. I'm also Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of a company that aims to commercialize meat. And my lab and our company is focusing on the fiber-based technology. So how does that work? Here you have a muscle cell. You may remember that from high school biology. It's actually a big cell consisting of a number of cells. It's a merger of a large number of cells, in this case, a couple of hundred of cells. And you see all these green ellipsoids. Those are the nuclei that are merged into a muscle fiber. And you see those cross striations here, which are basically a visualization of the very kind of regular weave of those contractile proteins. But you also see that there are two other nuclei here in white. And they were described for the first time in the 60s. And in 2000, Michael Rudnicki described them as the bona fide stem cells of our muscle. These are stem cells. Every muscle fiber has 4 or 5 of those stem cells, and they're basically sitting there doing nothing, waiting to repair that tissue when it's injured. So the technology is relatively simple. You take a small biopsy from a cow. It's typically 1 centimeter long, 1 millimeter in diameter, about half a gram or so, has a couple of hundred of these stem cells. And what these stem cells are good at is proliferating. And that's exactly what we need, because this only makes sense if from the very small sample you can create a lot of meat. So these stem cells are very good at proliferating, and because these are tissue-specific stem cells, they're also good at making tissue after that, and only one particular tissue, in this case, muscle tissue. So what we have done is, this is just to show that this is when we culture the cells, and of course, to let them proliferate, we have to culture them. So we culture the cells for a number of days, and here you see how many doublings they undergo. And this doubling thing is a little bit like the old kind of legend where chess players are playing, and one of the chess players says, if I win, I want 1 grain of rice on the first part of the checkboard, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, 4 on the 8 on the fourth, and then at the end of the checkboard, which is 64 of those little pieces, you end up with enough rice to feed India for 3 years. So it's an exponential process. So if they go through these doublings, and you see that from animal to animal, it's pretty consistent in how they grow over time. And if you do that math, if you calculate how many cells you need for 1 kilogram of beef, we are currently at about 32, 35 doublings. And that means that from half a gram of tissue, we can create 2,000 kilos of meat, which is important because then you can reduce the number of cows, reduce greenhouse gas emission, and so forth. So that's the basis. Now, but then of course, you don't only want cells, you want meat. So the cells have to start creating meat. And the first thing they need to do is to merge into a muscle fiber. That's because that's what a muscle fiber in the end is. And that instruction is very, very easy. If you starve those cells when they're growing, they almost automatically start to merge into a muscle fiber. And then, of course, they have to perform labor to become a good, beefy piece of muscle. And that's also relatively easy. We put those merged muscle fibers in a gel. That gel is actually pretty important. I will talk about that later. And we put them in a ring structure. Why a ring structure? Because when they start to form the tissue and they start to find each other and start to attach to each other, which they kind of do automatically, then they start to contract. And that contraction obviously leads to movement, but since they are in a ring structure, they cannot really move. And then that contraction translates into tension. And that tension is the biggest trigger for bulking up muscle. Think about it, if you run marathons, you don't get really thick muscles. Movement in itself doesn't create thick muscles. You have to go to the gym and lift weights or something against the resistance. That tension is a much bigger trigger for growing muscle than movement itself. So we let them do that for 3 weeks. And after 3 weeks, you have a muscle fiber that under the microscope looks exactly the same as the muscle fiber that you take from a steak or from a cow, for that matter. So in 2013, we produced 10,000 of these muscle fibers by hand. It was quite a tedious work. And we created a hamburger from it and presented it in London in a sort of a hybrid between a press conference and a cooking show. Oh, by the way, here you see that that protein content of those muscle fibers. Here you see the protein content of our muscle fiber. This is from a model muscle kind of tissue that you can grow in the lab. And this is from a mouse muscle. So we are somewhere in between. We're not quite there yet at the mouse muscle level, but we are way above the model system. So here's a short video of that presentation in London. This was the hamburger. By the way, it cost us 250,000 euro to make that hamburger. So it was not a cheap product. It was cooked and eaten by 2 food critics, one from Vienna and one from Chicago. And they said, oh yeah, this is a hamburger. Because we create in essence the same meat, the same tissue that you have when you take it out of the cow. Now, there were quite a few problems with that hamburger, other than that it was 250,000 euros. So we had to go through a lot of developments to make that into a product. And first, and importantly, it has to be an efficient product. So cell culture in itself, or tissue culture for that matter, is not necessarily efficient. It requires a lot of plastic, it's very artificial. You have to have the right type of cell. You need to find a way to scale it up. So all of those issues you need to tackle, because this is typically a medical technology, very expensive, not very efficient, and at very low scale, very small scale. So one of the things that you can do is be much more specific with what cell type you actually take out of that muscle. So if you take a biopsy from a cow, you get a number of cells here on the left. And you can do quite sophisticated selection in trying to get exactly the cell that you want to have that has the best replicative capacity and also differentiating capacity into muscle tissue. So we developed a strategy. This is a FACS sorter. Some of you may not be familiar with that, but basically this machine looks at every single cell and sees whether, on the basis of criteria that we have set, whether it should be in the left bin or the right bin. And so we can select from a large group of cells, we can select the cells that we particularly want. And we have chosen 2 markers, CD56 and CD29, not really important for this discussion, but if you do that, you turn out with a very pure stem cell fraction of that muscle. And if you work with that, you get actually pretty good results. They all differentiate. This is kind of a beautiful picture, but kind of weird. But you see here all those muscle fibers merged. And here you see in this particular case that these are merged, but there are also still a lot not merged. And in some situations, it's even better. And we now, as I mentioned, consistently after 35 doublings, we get basically nice differentiation of these muscle cells. We have to scale up. Cell culture is not easily scalable, especially not mammalian cells. Mammalian cells, like muscle cells, have to attach to something. They have to attach to a surface. And currently these are plastic surfaces, so you use a lot of plastic. That's a no-go. So fortunately, in the industry, a number of methods have been developed to scale this up to large tanks. Say, 500 or 5,000 or even 500,000 liter tanks. And how do you do that? You basically use microspheres. Here are those small kind of balls. They are a tenth of a millimeter in diameter, a little bit more. And the white dots on these spheres are actually the cells. And they are in suspension. The balls are in suspension. And the cells grow on these little spheres. And that works, and that also works beautifully for our cells. And in this way, you can actually scale up your production. The other set of problems that you have to worry about is this actually sustainable? Is this sustainable in terms of all the materials that you use? Can you recycle? Can you improve the efficiency of the system? And one of the first problems that you encounter is that when you culture mammalian cells outside of the body, you typically use a blood-derived product, serum. And this serum comes from, guess what? From cows. So in our thinking, of course, we're going to reduce the number of cows tremendously. And if that happens, we don't have enough blood to culture our cells anymore. So we have to get rid of that serum, also for all sorts of other reasons, but this is the most easy to understand. We have to get rid of that serum. That gel where those cells are sitting in when they form that ring structure works very well if that's a collagen gel. And that also comes from cows, from skin of cows. So we had to replace that as well by a plant-based product, and we had to start thinking about recycling. So here, this is a growth curve, a little bit different from the one that you saw before because the axes are a little bit different, but again, here are just days and here is doublings. And this is the control, this blue line, this is the medium that still has serum in it, so that's on top. But you see that some of the serum-free media, what we call serum-free media, are behaving more or less the same. So we now have developed very good serum-free media that allow the cells actually to grow and still differentiate. We're still improving on that and still making it cheaper and things like that. But in essence, that problem is relatively easy to solve. The gel is slightly harder. I love this experiment. This is an experiment that is kind of an example in biomaterial research. This is a Petri dish with a collagen gel, and here are two silk wires glued to the bottom of the dish. Now, nothing happens with that gel unless you throw cells on it. If you throw cells on it, within 24 hours, it organizes into a structure like this. It kind of, you see here still the contours of the original gel. It kind of compacts the whole thing, draws all the gel structure to the cells, and squeezes out all the water. Gel is 99% water anyway, but here it has squeezed out all the water and has become a compact tissue. And if you do this with muscle cells, it kind of aligns neatly in between those two silk wires. But for that the cells have to actually grab the polymer structure of that gel. And that is a specific function. So we have replaced the gel with alginate. Alginate is a food grade gel that is being used in the kitchen all the time, and it makes wonderful gels. However, the cells are happy with it, but they don't grab it. They cannot really attach to it. So what we did is we added small peptides, RGD peptides, that the cell recognizes as something that they can hold on to, attach that to the polymer structure of the alginate. And then you see here is volume change, here is that squeezing out of the water with a high RGD content. And we're still improving the chemistry of that, but it's in essence, that's a functional system. You can do that with other edible gels like cellulose, chitin from seashell animals, and carrageenan, which is also a kind of an alginate. But in all those cases, you have to what we call functionalize with RGD peptides or other peptides. So this is just an example. Here you see one of our muscle bundles. Again, those merged fibers, nice muscle bundles with a particular other type of gel that we have been using, which is laminin based. One particular aspect of this that I really, really like is because it's a contained culture system, you can actually start thinking very easily about recycling. So if you think about it, if cells grow in a suspension, they basically, they start to, of course, absorb sugars and amino acids and vitamins in their environment, and they start to grow, and they basically start to metabolize. So if they metabolize, they also produce waste. And that waste stays in that same environment. So basically the cells are swimming in their own urine, if you like. And after a couple of days, you have to replace the medium and have to give them basically a fresh start. Now, if you do that, if you throw away that medium, here are the essential amino acids, here are non-essential amino acids. And if you look at those amino acids, even after 7 days of culture, which is already pretty long, you see that some amino acids are still there and they're still not consumed. Some are much more consumed. Isoleucine is very much consumed. So there's a wide range of consumption of those valuable products in that medium. So if you throw it away after 3 or 7 days, you throw away a lot of resources, basically. So we did quite a bit of research on this, how we can recover this. And there are various ways. But one important element is that the ammonium, which is a waste product, has to be removed from the medium, and then they can go on for much longer with the same feedstock. But obviously, what we're also trying is to just feed a culture with isoleucine and all the amino acids that are being consumed to see if we can keep them going for a longer time. Then finally, that meat that we are producing or think we are producing has to be kind of the same, also for consumers. It has to have the same color, has to have the same texture, and it obviously has to have the same taste. The color of meat comes from a protein called myoglobin. And myoglobin is a hemoglobin type of protein that has that turns red if it's exposed to oxygen and turns blue if it's not exposed to oxygen. And our cells in the beginning didn't produce a lot of myoglobin. Now, if you grow the cells with lower oxygen conditions, then they start to increase that myoglobin production. That was already known in literature, but that was not something new that we found out, but our cells behave exactly the same as other cells that have been tested before. And this is nice because now they are pink. They contain that heme iron, which is an important nutritional value of meat. And presumably it also adds to the taste, although the verdict is still out there. Here you see another just example of how myoglobin here is myoglobin. This is myoglobin from a seal. That's a very high level of myoglobin. Our cells are somewhere here. Now, the other component of meat, as you might think, and rightfully so, that is important for taste and also for consistency, I guess, is fat. So that hamburger in 2013 did not contain fat. And to make fat tissue is kind of counterintuitively harder actually than to make muscle tissue. We can create fat tissue from stem cells. Also, fat tissue has stem cells. And we can extract those stem cells from a piece of fat from a cow and turn it, and they can proliferate too. So you can expand the amount of fat tissue and then turn it into real fat tissue. Now, traditionally, the stimuli to make fat tissue, these are in yellow here, are actually some of those components you don't really want to have in your food. This is an experimental procedure. It's not meant to be eaten. So we had to redesign that system to make it compatible with food. And that turned out, well, not that easy, but it's somewhat intuitive, because if you basically add fatty acids, triglycerides, then they will take that fat up. If you add insulin, they will start to become fat tissue. So here, all this green here is fat tissue. A particular thing about fat tissue is, or fat cells, if you like, is once you're very successful in making large fat cells, they become buoyant because fat is lighter than water. So they start to float on the surface and then they die. So you have to encase them in a biomaterial, and in this case, they are encased in, again, an alginate. This alginate doesn't have to have RGD because there's not really a lot of interaction between the alginate and the fat cell. So here's another example, and here are a couple of examples of those fatty acids, like mustanic acid does a wonderful job. And all here, in this case, all the red is fat tissue. Now, if you start thinking about that, if you can make fat tissue, maybe you can also coerce these fat cells to make omega-3 fatty acids and make the hamburger basically a little bit healthier for you. And of course, that's something that we would like to do. Now, the fourth element, in addition to kind of efficiency and sustainability and mimicry, is that people have to eat it. And when we presented this in London, the popular press had these headlines like Frankenfood and Lab Burger and Yuck. And I was a little bit frustrated by that, not because, you know, because of the reaction, but because I didn't quite understand where this came from. And nobody could really explain this. It is kind of a reservation against a food like this. And I do kind of understand it, but I would like to, you know, understand it a little bit better. And one of my issues, for instance, one of my issues is that there's a lot to be said about this, but one of my issues is the hot dog. Why eat people hot dogs? Do they know what this is? Do they understand how it's being made? So how come, if they don't understand, they eat it? And how come that this is admittedly a high-tech kind of product, and it's easy to appreciate that people don't quite understand what it is, and that creates some sort of anxiety. But apparently for a hot dog, we have overcome that anxiety. It's no longer there. So we are perfectly capable of eating stuff that we don't quite understand. But we have to get over a hurdle. And I think that mostly has to do, if you talk to people about this, mostly has to do with it being unknown, unfamiliar, and not realizing whether, not understanding whether this is safe or not. We are biologically programmed not to eat stuff that we don't know. If you go into the forest and you forage mushrooms and you make soup of it and you don't know what you're doing, you have a fair chance that you poison yourself. So it's a perfectly natural reaction. But it has to do with not understanding and not knowing this and not knowing for sure that this is safe. Now, we did a study, and it actually was published last week, where we asked the question, what type of information do people need about this product to increase acceptance? So we had 193 participants, age and socioeconomic status and gender kind of matched in the south of the Netherlands, divided them in 3 groups. One group got information about societal benefits of this cultured meat, that is, for the environment and animals and stuff like that. One group got information about personal benefits, that it's a safe product and maybe safer than regular meat. And one got information of that is just high quality meat. And then we did something unusual. We had them taste 2 pieces of a hamburger, one that was labeled conventional hamburger and the other that was labeled cultured hamburger. And in fact, they were exactly the same. They were both conventional hamburgers. So we tricked the people into letting them think that they were eating a piece of cultured hamburger. And we asked questions before we gave the information, after we gave the information, and after they had the tasting. And this is a somewhat complex outcome slide where, so we basically ask the questions, are you in favor of this technology? Do you want to taste it? Do you want to buy it? And do you want to replace your current meat consumption with cultured meat consumption? And we asked those questions before we gave information, after we gave information, and after tasting. And the colors represent the different groups: societal benefits, personal benefits, and it's a high quality product. And what you immediately see is that there's no difference between the colors. They're all kind of the same. Here, maybe a little bit different. Meaning that it doesn't really matter what type of information you give. But you see here, for instance, that if you give an information, acceptance, which starts at about 50%, increases to about 80%, just by giving information. And again, it doesn't really matter what type of information. Surprisingly, almost everyone wanted to taste it. Which is, so people are kind of adventurous. They want to know what it is. They want to, and apparently the tasting doesn't really translate into an issue with safety. If you eat it once, you're probably fine. The safety issue probably is kind of a long-term consumption. So what was also obvious is that if people already knew what cultured meat was, their acceptance was a lot higher. So getting familiar with the concept increases acceptance. Interestingly, everybody ate the piece of meat that was labeled cultured without any exception. And when we asked them how it tasted, and remember they were all exactly the same, they thought that the cultured piece of meat tasted better than the original. And this is kind of known, I guess. If you if you pour jerry can wine into an expensive bottle, the taste becomes better. It's a relative and subjective thing. So how about the price? Can we reduce the price of this really, really, really expensive hamburger? And you have to understand that this comes from a medical technology. So all the ingredients are pharmaceutical grade and therefore very expensive. And also, by the way, not available at scale. So we have done a lot of calculations, and I must say these are mostly kind of projections with a couple of assumptions. Assumptions being that you can make that serum replacer eventually very cheap, which is kind of a good assumption because similar proteins are made in the feed industry at very, very low prices. So it's kind of just waiting for that to happen. You can recycle. That will reduce the price up to a factor of 3 or so. And then finally, you can reduce the price of the single ingredients. So the ingredients of this feed is sugar, vitamins, minerals, amino acids. And again, they're all kind of pharmaceutical grade that we're currently using, so expensive. And we are currently collaborating with animal feed providers who use exactly the same ingredients to see whether they are as functional, and we can source that a lot cheaper. So currently we are at a price of about 140 euro per kilogram. which is already way lower than the 250 for one hamburger, of course, but still a little bit too high. So this is kind of, if it would come to the market right now, it would be a premium product. So we are thinking of just using fodder beets and peas or soybeans as ingredients for that medium. Up to 3 years ago, we were the only ones in the world doing this. And right now there is about 40 companies worldwide pursuing similar things. And again, either cell-based or tissue-based or fiber-based. One other element that is true for actually most markets, I think, is that you have to prove that this is safe. In Europe, it's the European Food Safety Authority in Parma. This is, by the way, not GMO. That would make it more complex in Europe, but it's not GMO, so that's fine. But this has to go through the novel food procedure, meaning that we have to provide evidence. We as a company or as an academic lab have to provide evidence that this is safe, and they have to review that evidence and judge whether that's enough or not. And once it's approved for the entire European Union, for all the member states. This, however, may take 1.5 years. So this is quite a time-consuming procedure. So my dream for the future is actually a very simple one, that we can continue to eat meat and cherish food with our families as we are used to, with all the kind of choices that we are gradually gotten used to over the last decades, without the negative consequences on the environment, animal welfare, and also food security. And finally, a small impression of the group of people. We are now with about 40, very enthusiastically working towards kind of the first market introduction of what first will be a hamburger. And with that, I would like to conclude, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Well, Professor Post, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. I think many of us were aware that there's a problem with eating too much meat and the jet-propelled cows that you showed so appropriately on your picture. But more seriously, most of us thought it had to be done via a vegetable route. So this has been quite a revelation, and the potential is obviously huge. And a lovely example in our context of CSAR, of the application of research. But perhaps we could move now to some questions. Again, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, the approach is that if you would like to ask a question, do it on your keyboard to Q&A, and I will be able to see some of them as they come through on my screen, and I'll invite you or I will read them out and ask Professor Post to respond. If some of you want to put your hands up, if you're very excited about being on the telly, as it were, then raise your hand. I think you'll find at the bottom of your screen the way of doing that. And again, we'll do our best to bring you in an orderly manner. But perhaps we could start with my reading out one from text here. I guess this is something that will be occurring to several of us. How do we compare the energy that you need either now or may do in the future to produce the meat with the energy that's consumed by the way it's done at the moment?
Yeah, to be fair, we don't know. There are a couple of life cycle analyses out now. One of the first actually being from the University of Oxford, from Hanatu Amisto. And the outcome of that study was that it would be a reduced amount of energy needed to grow this meat. But since then, a couple of other life cycle analyses have come out with different results. They are kind of the same on saving of water and land, but they differ in the saving in energy. And so it all depends on assumptions. These life cycle analyses typically are very useful if you already have a complete production process in place and you can do all those calculations. If the production process in its entirety is not in place yet, you have to rely on assumptions. And depending on these assumptions, you end up with higher amount of energy, same amount of energy, or lower amount of energy. Now, for me, it's important whether that energy consumption is translated into greenhouse gas emission or not. So none of these life cycle analyses have really taken that into account, that in parallel with this development, you will have a transition in energy. Hopefully that will very quickly reduce the greenhouse gas emission associated with energy production. So personally, I believe, but of course I am biased, that this will reduce the amount of energy that we need. But the big unknown really is in the feed production, not in the cell or tissue production itself, that we kind of know doesn't require a lot of energy, but the feed production will require more energy than in cows, because we need to refine, we need to make it into much finer particles for the cells to be able to work with it.
Yeah. And one quick rider, if I may. Are there other processes, high volume, large scale biological processes, which are in some ways analogous to what you're doing?
Yeah, there are. As I mentioned, there are these industrial kind of fermenters where people produce single cell proteins, like in the UK, for instance, there's a mycoprotein, which is the basis of corn. Essentially also a fermentation process, but using a different cell, of course. There are also mammalian cells used to produce vaccines or proteins in the pharmaceutical industry. And some of them are really, really large scale.
Great, thank you. Now we're going to try a new bit of technology and try and bring in someone who's raised their hand. Now, I'm asking Edward whether I can see Robert Whitfield. Would you like to ask your question, Mr. Whitfield? The electrons are rushing down the wires to you now, Mr. Whitfield. Right. Would you like to ask your question? Hello, we can see you now. Fire away if you would. Are you on mute by any chance?
According to the list, he's not muted.
Can you hear us, Mr. Whitfield? Okay. So let me go to another question from a keyboard. And I know this is a bit of a how long is a piece of string question, Professor Post, but how long before feasibly, let's say everything went just as you hoped, when might be able to get one in our local supermarket?
Those are two qualifiers. One is UK and the other is supermarket. The supermarket probably being more important, to be honest, than the UK, because my feeling is that for supermarket it has to be cheap. It has to be price competitive with regular meat. So as I mentioned, currently we probably can, in 2-3 years, can get something to the market. That's the 2-3 years is actually mostly from regulatory approval, for, let's say, about 10-15 euro for a hamburger. So that's nice for restaurants and for specialty stores, not for supermarkets. For supermarkets, that price has to come down. And I mentioned there are two factors. One is to get those serum replacers made very, very cheaply. There are now 6-7 companies working on that. and the other is to get the other ingredients very cheaply. And that may happen in the next 3 years, or it may take a couple of years longer.
But it's well within reach, isn't it? Right, I see Alexander Wilson would like to come in. I can't see his hand, but I can see his name. Mr. Wilson, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, if you can hear me. Thank you, Professor Prost. I think Mike has sort of preempted my question a little bit, because I was going to ask about economies of scale, because your data and presentation showed that the cost was very high, but obviously still in, to a degree, the experimental stage. But moving to mass production, do you see the economies of scale obviously bringing the prices down? But is that an easy thing to sort of achieve, or might it remain a sort of niche market product that might be manufactured on the International Space Station, for example, for the for astronauts? And I think Mike's also mentioned about the time to market, so you're looking for 3 years, but it's basically economies of scale question, really. I think I'm looking for an answer for.
Yeah, I think the big cost reduction comes from the two factors that I mentioned. The next cost reduction obviously comes from economy of scale, having a factory with a couple of large bioreactors and producing tons of meat in a week. That production is important, but it's incremental compared to the others. Because then all of the investments and the amount of labor, you can kind of economize there, but it's an order of magnitude less efficient than the first two steps. So in the end, the question, is this going to be something like a microbrewery type of thing in your neighborhood, or is this going to be a large multinational with huge factories with resulting economy of scale? And it's probably, hopefully, going to be a mixture of both, because there will always be people who want to have it 3 cents cheaper, and then you have to have economy of scale.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Alexander. I rather like the idea of artisan cultured meat, but anyway. I see a question on my screen here from David Brosso. Would it be possible to follow a similar process for chicken or pork?
Yeah, and in fact, some of those companies are doing that. There are now 3 or 4 companies doing fish, 2 or 3 doing pork, and a lot more doing chicken. The technology is essentially the same. The reason why we prefer beef, there are a couple. One is, as I mentioned, it's the least efficient animal and the most kind of detrimental to the environment. The second is that it's already a high value product, so it's easier to reach kind of price parity there. And the third is that it's not easy to mimic with plant-based proteins. They're getting better and better, but it's much easier to mimic chicken than to mimic beef. So I think that those are the choices. We kind of accidentally moved to beef, but rationalized it afterwards.
Thank you. And I see a hand up or a voice up. Nigel, would you like to come in, please?
Well, it really depends whether my microphone's working.
It is.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Go ahead,
well, brilliant. Yeah, because we're using 3 different computers to try and get the whole picture. But the question is basically, you mentioned microbreweries. To try and get an idea of the scale, because we missed the first part of your talk. And if you go to a normal brewery, you're dealing with containers like 2,000 or 5,000 litres. Your reactor vessels, what sort of size would you see are necessary for producing a practical quantity of material?
Yeah, about the same size. to 5,000 to 2,000, 5,000 liter. You can go much higher than that, although it has not been tested yet, but you potentially can go higher. But I don't know whether that's going to be an advantage, to be honest. So that 2,000, 5,000 liter would be about the right scale.
Thank you.
Right, it's the same as for beer.
We won't get into debate about which is more useful, beer or beef. Can I go to another question from a keyboard here? Professor Voss, you mentioned that you may be able to substitute fats so that it contains omega-3 and is more healthy. To what extent could we take this process to make a healthy burger?
Right. Our first kind of fat analysis actually turned out to have quite a few polyunsaturated fatty acids. The issue that we need to discover still is, the fat is a big driver of taste, and especially metabolites and oxidated products of the fat are a big driver of taste. And omega-3 fatty acids are associated with fishy tastes. So you want to find the right balance between having a large amount of omega-3 fatty acids and not have it taste like fish.
Understood. Well, I think we're coming towards the end, folks. If anybody is desperate to ask a question, either by putting their hand up or by tapping on their keyboard, now would be a very good time. I'm going to aim to close it around 8:30. Professor Post has been very good in giving us his time, but he's probably ready for a cup of coffee, I should think. Anyway, any more written or hand up questions, please?
I see a question on the screen of whether the number of vegans is true.
Yes. Sorry, I missed that one. Far away.
Yeah, I do get a lot of questions, and Mike, you already mentioned you always thought that we would go plant-based, and I think to some extent we are, and if I talk to audiences in universities in Zurich or Berlin or in London, 25% of the students are vegetarian and 10% is vegan. So that easily gives you the impression that that number is rising. And I certainly feel that we are not looking at vegetarians and vegans anymore as kind of a weird lifestyle. It's more accepted now than it was, let's say, 10 years ago. So something is changing. However, at a global scale, it's in the reverse direction. And that's because of that link to gross domestic product. So on a global scale, I'm very pessimistic. And it's still, in the course of 30, 40 years, we may gradually move towards a more plant-based diet. And I certainly hope so. Although I personally still like to eat meat.
And I see a final two questions here, which perhaps is asking you to tell us about the competition, which is rather unfair. But one of our questioners says, I first ate textured vegetable protein in the 1970s and thought it was all right. Why hasn't it caught on?
Yeah, well, I think what is happening currently, which is good, is that a couple of American companies, notably Impossible Food and Beyond Burger, are marketing these products to meat eaters. Originally, those products were always marketed to vegetarians and vegans, and they were kind of in a niche in the supermarket. You could hardly find them. They were expensive. And only I'm now kind of generalizing, but only very unhealthy people were looking in those corners of the supermarket. But it has become mainstream, and these companies are really marketing meat eaters and not vegetarians and vegans, and that increases acceptance and market share appreciably. Whether this is kind of whether we see kind of the first start of a hype and whether it will go down again, we don't know. I certainly hope not. But I think this is the crucial part in our culture, that we gradually start to accept that we could also live off a vegetarian diet or even a vegan diet with these products. And that's fine, I think. It's a little bit hard for me to believe that if you have the choice between a product that really is meat with all its kind of characteristics and which we are accustomed to, and a product that is basically a meat kind of analog, but it's a different kind of composition, I think we would want to have that choice in the future. And my guess is that people will want to have real meat instead of plant-based, provided that you can solve the problems, the same problems.
Well, thank you, Professor Post. I, for one, would feel much better about eating my burger if it had come via your process. In fact, I rather like the idea of a product which has been through a properly organized manufacturing process rather than turned up from I don't quite know where, I don't quite know how. So I find this very attractive. The market will decide eventually, yes, no doubt, but it's been an absolutely fascinating evening. Thank you so much. And as I said earlier on, a lovely example of how a deep understanding of the science, the biology and the chemistry can be turned into something of extremely practical importance, and it might even taste nice as well.
Right.
So thank you very much indeed. And could I ask those of you who are on the call, in your rooms, you're used to clapping on a Thursday night. Could I ask you to clap on a Monday night? While you're doing that, let me thank you again, Professor Post, and perhaps I could ask Edward to put up some concluding slides. First of all, I guess you can see that now. There'll be a video recording of the lecture on our website and on YouTube. So ask your friends. I'm sure when they hear you talking about it, they'll want to see it, and they can. And I'm delighted, I must say it, the number of people who've managed to get on this evening. So that's a great start, and thank you for joining in. We're keen to hear your feedback. This is a bit of a trial on this format. Can this webinar malarkey really work? It does seem to me to have huge possibilities. That there is a major disadvantage that we can't go to the bar together, but presumably you can go to your fridge in the room next door. That's assuming you're not in the kitchen already. So we would be pleased to hear your feedback on this approach and how you think it's gone, please. Something that's arisen, I don't know if you heard of this coronavirus, I don't know what that's all about, but apparently somebody's interested in it. And that the suggestion is that perhaps we could experiment with a rather different format, perhaps a mini seminar in the middle of the day with a few people with deep expertise in a field speaking rather briefly, but then being open to more extensive questions. We'd be interested to get your thoughts on that, and we'll send out a questionnaire, if you don't mind another questionnaire, to ask you whether you think that would be something that would be welcome. The idea, as you appreciate, is that rather than just watching people on the telly and shouting at the telly, we might actually be able to ask people with deep expertise to answer our questions rather than other people's. So please let us know what you think about that in due course. And finally, next week, not a fortnight's time, but next week, is the story about Dieselgate. Those of you who have Volkswagens will be particularly interested. But here again, the science has been very revealing about what's been happening post the Dieselgate scandal. And John German will be talking to us about that. So without further ado, unless there are any, Edward, the brains behind this, is sitting in the control room in a huge tower in the middle of Cambridge, looking down on us all. Anything else I should be saying, Edward?
No, thank you.
No, Edward says it's okay. So good night, everybody. Do please head for your own refrigerator. And I look forward to meeting you in the bar in a few months rather than a few minutes. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thanks.